Hi, my name is Felicia and I currently have a problem. I am being haunted by 1940s nightgown dresses. Every store I go into has these gorgeous satin and silk dresses with their little diagonal waistlines and the bias cut skirts that just fall so nicely. And if I was being reasonable, I would say that $40 is a fairly decent price to spend on a long dress. But alas, I'm not sensible. I'm frugal to a fault. So we're gonna figure out how to make one ourselves without spending a single penny, because I've been hoarding fabric for years and it's time to raid the bins. The first step to making this obsession a reality is to draft a pattern for it, which is admittedly not the easiest way to do this. If I was fancy with draping, I would have probably tried that out, but I prefer the math of drafting, even if half the time I make it double the size because I'm scared about wiggle room and then end up taking it in a ton, which may or may not have been the case with this exact dress. Anyways, I started off with a basic 1-dart bodice block as my base piece, and even though it was designed with a 1-inch dart at the bust point, I ended up incorporating that dart because I knew that I wanted to gather this slightly at that area. So the little extra fabric was welcome. I wish I could say I had a strategy for making this, but I knew that it needed to be vaguely triangular, so I just drew a lot of diagonal lines until I felt like it would fit on me, which is maybe not the most helpful thing in a tutorial. Basically, I established a shoulder size and then drew a triangle. For the skirt, I started by copying over the bottom half of that same bodice block, which guaranteed that it would fit over my hips, then copied over the same diagonal line from the bust triangle that I just finished making, that the empire waistline seam would match up nicely. I only drafted the first little chunk of it because it's going to be on the bias and I wasn't sure how wide I'd be able to make it. So with a vague plan, a triangle, and the top half of a skirt, I got to work cutting out the fabric. This is admittedly my least favorite part of any given project. It is so absurdly stressful to think about the fact that you have bought this fabric. It's fabric that you found at a store, probably took some time to hunt it down, and then you took the time to draft a pattern for it and have this whole grand plan. But if you make one cut wrong, everything is ruined and your plan is garbage. It's only made so much worse when it turns out it has to be a bias cut. Luckily, after folding the fabric in half and then folding one corner up so that I had a couple of triangles stacked on top of each other, I had plenty of material to get a pretty perfect bias cut skirt out of this. Then it was just a matter of piecing together enough fabric for the total of 4 triangles, 2 sets that I have an outside and a lining for each side of the bust. And remembering that I would also need some straps in order to connect the top of the bust at the shoulder to the waist in the back of the dress. I actually had a pretty decent amount of this fabric left over in the end, so after vaguely measuring the straps, I had my 4 rectangles and plenty of excess to deal with later. While this would normally be the point that I moved to my studio, it's like 10,000 degrees out there, so I decided to move my studio to my kitchen counter. Once everything was set up, I decided to organize my fabric. I matched up the inside and outside of the 2 bust pieces left and right so that the right sides were facing each other, and then sewed those 2 layers together along the deep V neckline of the dress. After the neckline was sewn on both left and right pieces, I moved on to the other side of the triangle, the other more vertical side, I guess, where your arm would be. I don't know what you call that. That's a weird word. It's not really a side seam or like an arm side. I don't know. The other vertical side. I made sure to leave the shoulder seam open for the strap to go through it eventually. At this point though, my fabric was fraying all to hell, so I went ahead and zigzag stitched all of those seams that I just sewn on either of the triangular pieces. And to give it a nice finished look, I went ahead and ironed at this point. Admittedly, I probably should have done much sooner to ensure that these weren't already creased when I started sewing. I just really don't like ironing all that much, so I usually procrastinate it. At least my tiny iron is pretty cute. To ensure that my straps would actually fit in the little shoulder seam that I left open, I went ahead and measured from seam to seam there. I grabbed the 2 straps that I cut out and folded it in half to ensure that that half length was the correct size for the strap opening that I had. Be wondering why this was necessary if I did in fact cut out the strap to fit here, but I don't trust myself with math, so I always triple check these things. It was time to make a bunch of tubes. With each strap folded in half, right sides together, I sewed along the long edge and then zigzag stitched to finish them off. The straps were sewn together, I needed to turn them right side out. Even though these straps were about 2 inches wide, Turning them by hand was still a brave choice. Perhaps a just plain stupid one, given that there was a safety pin sitting right next to me. Attach the strap to the triangles. I stuffed the strap into the middle, the two already sewn together triangles, making sure to check that the side seam of the strap was facing the side of the triangle, rather than the V-neck. I sewed the opening closed and did a little zigzag to make sure it was nice and secure. And of course, repeated with the other side. We've done a lot of work, so it's time for a puppy break. And look at these guys. They're so cute. Puppy Anya is fairly obsessed with her big brother Strider. If you couldn't tell from the absolutely non-existent space between them. Actually, when I came over to say hi, all she wanted to do was chew on my jeans. Freaking adorable. Back to work. With the top of the dress mostly sewn, it's time to move on to the skirt. I wanted one side to have a slit up the side seam, so I measured out vaguely where I wanted that to hit and stuck a pin in it. Matched that pin into the back skirt panel, then pinned the side seams and sewed straight up pinned area. After the straight stitching, I went ahead and finished that off with some zigzag stitching and of course the obligatory ironing. Large area to cover did have me slightly regretting the cuteness factor of my iron and wishing it was a bit larger. To finish off the slit, I double rolled the two edges as best I could, still keeping the seam quite small so that it wouldn't be super bulky or noticeable in the final draping. As the entire reason we went through the hassle of a bias skirt is that perfect drape at the end. After yet another session with the iron, this is what we are left with for that slit. Looking nice and clean, I'm happy with it. It's time to attach the two pieces together. So the triangles to the skirt though, we have to deal with that extra fabric that we left in during the drafting process. Marked an arbitrary 5 inches in from the center V-neck on either triangle, and then gathered up until that point, using the widest stitch that my machine can do and leaving either end open without back stitching. I repeated the gathering stitches in those first 5 inches on the other triangle too, and then moved on to actually gathering that material together, attempting to make the gathers nice and even between the two pieces so that there wasn't like wonky bits where some areas had a bit more bulk than others. Last up, I double checked that I had gathered the same amount in on either piece, not just the same shape. With the gather sorted out, it's time to pin the bodiced triangles to the skirt piece. I started by matching up the V-neck to the center point on the front of the skirt, and then just walking that seam around, pinning as I went. The triangle pieces weren't meant to meet all the way in the very back, so I just double checked that they were at the same stopping point on the back of the skirt. Then I took the pinned panels to the sewing machine and sewed all the way along those two edges, trying to keep it nice and straight to preserve the structure that I had drafted into it. Which is all well and good until I needed to resize some things to make it stay flat against me and kinda lost a little bit of that perfect diagonal, but I like the curvy shape that we get in the end anyways. With the front all sorted out, it was just a matter of taking care of the back piece where we had that opening without the two triangles sewn onto it. This was a bit tedious, but I just double rolled that hem, keeping it nice and slim, and then ironing it flat. Sensing a trend yet? I did a quick test fit at that point and ended up taking in a little bit of that triangle shape to decrease some of the extra fabric that was built up there. But after that was sorted, I hemmed the bottom edge, just double rolling and straight stitching all the way across. It's a surprising amount of material in this skirt. It really shows when you're hemming. The very last step in this dress, though, was to sew on the second half of the strap. The winner of the Instagram poll for how should the back of this dress look was the crisscross strap. Put the dress on one more time just to get the placement right, and then sewed the straps onto the back in an X shape. I cut off the excess length of the strap and tucked it inside and then sewed across that too to make sure there were no raw edges left. And now it's time for final results!